Hello. These fine walls were built by a hidden Cyclopean culture to be found in Iberia, but not that Iberia, the other Iberia, the one in the Caucasus, or today's Georgia. When looking for Cyclopean walls, most would be targeting Greece or Italy, as hardly anyone notices Cyclopean walls stretched all the way into Iberia, into both Iberias, and especially to the one on the east, which is a shame, because both the Iberians, but mostly the ones from the Caucasus, are the original Cyclops and the old Europeans. The European bit can be polemic due to nagging politics and wars that get in the way of anything nice. But the ancient stonework will leave us no doubt that Georgia was an integral part of the lost European culture that built Cyclopean walls. Georgia is an easily overlooked country. For a long time, it was just an obscure province of successive empires like the Soviet, Russian, Ottoman, Persian, and even the Roman. Despite all those overlords, Georgia managed to develop its own unique and often exotic approach to the European culture, such as they are Christian, like most Europeans, but of their own Georgian church, created by the 13 of the 12 apostles of Christ. They have an alphabet, but the letters are bonkers like no other, and write a language so strange it is unrelated to any of the big language families around, including the Indo-European and Semitic. Also not helping is them having bad luck with the names. Nowadays, Georgia gets confused with the state of Georgia in the USA. But their bad luck started during Greco-Roman times, when it was called Iberia, a name that just reminds us of the peninsula in the west of Europe, this Iberia, also named by the Romans, who are the culprits of this confusion. Were the Romans seeing double? Or were they onto something? Let's find out. This could be just a coincidence, but as someone very clever once said, coincidence takes planning. Do you like wine? I do too. It's an Iberian thing. So let's thank the very ancient Iberians, the ones in Georgia, for inventing the nectar of the gods, some 8,000 years ago. Georgia has a very rich and interesting prehistory, likely one of the best in the world, not the least because they invented wine, but also other shiny things. Another super relevant Georgian Neolithic invention is gold mining. This is a big deal because some people like gold a lot, even more than they like wine. It's crazy, I know. Nevertheless, either for gold or wine, Georgia soon attracted all types of foreigners, interested in meddling up with the land's internal affairs, initiating a parade of invasions that resulted in Georgia having spent only a tiny fraction of its time as an independent country. Luckily, this incoming pressure was dispersed by the geography of the place, with deep valleys and narrow mountain passes, not easy to get around, even less to control, allowing for whatever was local and old to persist over time, leading to the somewhat contradictory essence of the Georgian tale. On one hand, it is on the spotlight of all major trends of history, and on the other one, everything gets to be preserved with a distinctive local flavor. You know the flow. Before the Cyclops, there were the megaliths, the big rocks, dolmens and menhirs, things that Georgian did the Georgian way, i.e., both right on time in the 30th century BC and with a ton of local flair. There are plenty of dolmens in this region, thousands of them, most of them in the area now in Russia, on the northern slope of the Caucasus Mountains, leaving us with a slight misalignment on the map of the megaliths versus the Cyclopean walls. A gap that a time lapse of 1,000 years between the building dates of these two wonders could easily justify. Further stretching out, this particular Caucasian style of dolmens reached as far as Thrace in Bulgaria, which is interesting because we are told dolmen builders were not the traveling type, and that all dolmens around the world are unrelated creations, made by people that lived in isolation, which could be so if we were looking at far places like Korea, but not on the two sides of the Black Sea. Those dolmens are close enough and similar enough to be easily related. The dolmens in the Caucasus are brilliant, with great stonework composing elaborate structures that seem too good to be so old. But they are old. These Caucasian dolmens have been properly dated to the 4th millennium BC, due to carbon dating of dead bodies inside, which is more accurate than pottery. Although old in origin, the dolmen designs are so nice it feels some of them might have been redecorated by later people, trying to reuse the stones. Going beyond that, an even more tantalizing hypothesis is that a couple of the structures we see today may show a rare transition between the culture of the megaliths into the culture of the Cyclops. This is obviously a speculation, but let's think of it for a bit. For one to think that the Cyclopean wall builders are the descendants of the megalithic builders, it helps having some mixed structures, some stepping stone style, and that's precisely what the fancy dolmens look like. It would be very helpful for this hypothesis if we'd find more cases of mixed megalithic/Cyclopean style in other locations in Europe. But no other area was left with over 3,000 examples to be examined, so the mixed cases could have been lost. Or even more exciting, the transition from megalithic culture to the Cyclopean could have happened in Georgia and then expanded west once fully formed. There are a bunch of Cyclopean walls in Georgia, literally 100 or so. So many we have to consider them in groupings, which is helpful because the individual names are unpronounceable for reasons we will understand later. So here's what's still around. The most exquisite and refined stonework is to be found in Cyclopean villages, which somehow conserved a few houses built with tight-fitting bulky blocks, revealing a Cyclopean skill that is like top 5 compared with other Cyclopean works in Europe. Only 3 of these villages are still recognizable today, but it's fair to think there would be much more back in the day, that is, in the Bronze Age. Then we have the reused walls in relatively new church. Again, the names are so hard to even spell, it's better if I'll just leave the locations in the description. These are probably recent works, both imitating an ancient style and also reusing some of the blocks from pre-existing walls on sacred sites. And last but not least, at least by the numbers, there are the hill forts. They make up the bulk of the walls, being so many that cross the borders into what is now Armenia, Turkey and Azerbaijan. The stonework in the Cyclopean hill forts is not amazing, and most of the sites have no more than a hint of an ancient ruin, with just a handful still featuring more complex structures or large and imposing walls, often nested in hard-to-reach mountain tops. So far, we've been looking at Georgia as one area, but it is not. It's two, at least, with a separation that goes beyond the normal complication of ancient history. Old polities and borders are dynamic, and the degree of shading in the maps over time is to be expected. But in the particular case of Georgia, entering the Iron Age, it is more than just the movement. We have the land clearly separated into two entities. In the interior, where the Cyclopean walls are nowadays to be found, it was Iberia, whilst on the coast the land was called Colchis, and very different from Iberia. Because on top of not having Cyclopean walls, Colchis attracted too much foreign attention. The visitors include some curious characters, probably all made up. One of them was Jason and his Argonauts, who landed here looking for a golden fleece, likely due to the fame of the land as a gold mine. Later, Herodotus talks about an expedition by an Egyptian pharaoh that went all the way to the Black Sea in person, got into some fights with the Indo-European Scythians and retreated to establish a city on the east coast of the Black Sea. That same city, called Gonio, would later become a Roman outpost and a first step for adventurers crossing the Silk Road, and the final resting place of the 13 of the 12 apostles, all revealing a pattern, whereas the deep mountain passes allowed Georgia to be both very connected to all ancient civilizations, such as the Greeks, Egyptians, or even Chinese, and at the same time manages to keep its identity carefully preserved. For the advancement of our topic, there is one piece of mythology that it's worth telling. It goes like this. There is this giant creature called Amirani that steals the fire for metallurgy from the gods to give it to the common people, and for that is punished by being chained onto a mountain and having an eagle eat away his entrails over and over again. This should be familiar because it is the same story we know from Greece as the myth of Prometheus, a titan, brother to the Cyclops, that stole fire and got punished, and everything else the same story. Now, here's a shocker. Hercules, the slayer of the old gods, was commanded to find the Garden of the Hesperids. Trying to do that, he wandered around without success, until reaching the Caucasus to ask Prometheus. The Titan again spills the beans, giving away to Hercules the location of the garden. As a payback, Hercules releases Prometheus from his punishment. Not surprised? What if I told you that the garden Hercules was looking for was located in Iberia? This Iberia, in the peninsula, isn't it something? Yes, Hercules is looking for a secret garden in Iberia, and he finds his answer by talking to a snitch, brother to the Cyclops, stuck on the other Iberia. Maybe it is another coincidence. Was Iberia called Iberia by pure chance, or is it related to the other Iberia? Let's see. The Romans were not very considerate with cultural appropriation and other woke issues, and would easily call barbarian to anyone with poor table manners or enslaved. However, Iberia for the Romans did not sound like a racial slur. A parallel to Iberia could be made with the name Gaul, that the Romans saw everywhere, from Galicia to Galatia, Spain and Turkey. This was not because the Romans had had bad dreams with Asterix, but because all those peoples the Roman called Gauls were in fact Celts, all part of a tight ethnic group. The geographer Strabo could have helped us to sort this out, since he noted the double Iberias. But unfortunately, it's not clear if he believed them to be related or not. Nowadays, Iberia is said to be an exonym, a name that the locals would not recognize for themselves. But that's not quite true in the Caucasus. In their local language, Iberia, or more precisely Iberia, was a word people would use to call their land. So, let's keep the jury out on this for a little longer. Kartvelian is the technical name for the Georgian language, a very complex and unique tongue that does not belong to any of the standard families around. It is not Turkic nor Semitic, and more importantly, it is not Indo-European. You know, I've been repeating this idea on other videos, and if you don't, you better find out. It's awesome. Like this. Everywhere we find Cyclopean walls in Europe, we tend to also find remains of a pre-Indo-European language, unrelated to what most of us speak today. Such is the case of the Nuragic, the Hattian, and the Iberian. Those last two are super relevant. The Hattians were the people ruled by the Hittites and the builders of the fanciest polygonal walls in Turkey. Their Hittite masters were Indo-European, but not the Hattian workers. The subdued people talked a weird and lost language, of which the closest thing to a relative is the Kartvelian, or the Georgian. It even gets more juicy. Screening for links between the Georgian Kartvelian and other old languages, the closest one can find with some similarities in the grammar and structure are the languages of the Iberos and the Basques, both in the Iberian Peninsula. Awesome, right? So, who could tell that the people building in this strange Cyclopean way could also be talking in tongues and that those languages can be related? Getting to this point, I'd usually wonder if you are confused with all the facts. But in this case, I have a different question. Are you convinced yet? Because the bits and pieces we see around Europe about the Cyclops, who they were, and what they built, and how old are the walls, etc., those are often bogged down by prejudice and dogmas, raising more questions than answers. But not in the case of Georgia. There, the timeline just fits nicely into place, all seamlessly organized. First, we have a bunch of mud, brick, and caves, with the earlier settlers inventing wine, gold, and God knows what to make our lives more complicated. Then, these evolve into the megalithic monumental constructions with the dolmens and other big stones that, in the case of Georgia, seem to have evolved into a mixed style, transitioning to the next phase. Ever the best are the Cyclopean, with the polygonal walls, crazy languages, and usually even weirder religions, often misdated or misattributed, except in Georgia, that convinced academics to agree Cyclopean walls were built by the Iberians in the Bronze Age, up until being overwhelmed by a wave of Iron Age brutes, the Indo-Europeans, that would forge the classical and later medieval European cultures. Like the fine polygonal walls in Georgia, the odd pieces just fit. The Neolithic, the megalithic, the Cyclopean, the pre-classic, even the medieval. All major phases of European history are present in Georgia with absolute clarity, with some local and unique twists, but all unmistakably part of the larger cultural families in Europe. Here's the thing. We are not seeing double. The two Iberias have one eye. In one view, both Iberias were Cyclops, metaphorically, with just one eye. The Iberias are two locations sharing one way of seeing the world, thus it's one-eye culture in two places. Take this thought experiment. How would you recognize that two cultures are related? Is it the language, the myths, the architectural style, the names of the places? What about all of the above at the same time? Or put it in another way, if everything in Georgia is unique, with a style of its own, but at the same time shares unmistakable similarities with the other extreme of Europe, that is not a coincidence. That is the stuff cultures are made of, a baseline to be reinterpreted in different ways, keeping their essence. The heritage of Georgian Iberia, with its fine-fitted walls, hilltop towers, and strange language, is yet another reason why I think Cyclopean is not really about the one-eyed giant, nor building the walls alone, but it has an ancient lost culture from the deep past, a culture that we'll keep on trying to read. That's it for today. Hope you liked it. See you in the comments.